The generation that refused to be forgotten. They didn't just act in movies. They shaped how an entire country saw itself on screen. This was the era when fame wasn't built on viral moments or trending clips, but on performances that stayed with people long after the credits rolled. Some of these names became legends whispered in film schools and retrospectives. Others became household faces, laughed at dinner tables, or remembered for a single scene that still gets replayed decades later.
Sino yan? Kilala mo yan? Hindi ko kilala yan.
Sige na po, pumunta na kayo sa bahay namin.
Opo. May narinig kang po?
But here's where the debate begins. Was this generation defined by the ones who made audiences cry? Or the ones who made them laugh? By the stars who dominated headlines, or the quiet performers who carried entire stories from the background? Because depending on who you ask, the true icon of this era changes every time.
We had so much fun in the interview, and if you play it again in the interview and during the shoot.
Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming uploads. We dive into stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. And now, let's start with the name everyone else was measured against. And this is where every comparison quietly begins. Before rivalries, before comparisons, before anyone even asked to define this generation, there was a performer who changed what a leading lady was supposed to look like. Nora Aunor didn't arrive with the polished image of a studio-built star. She arrived with a presence that felt familiar, almost uncomfortably close to real life. Her roles weren't about perfection. They were about struggle, silence, and the small emotional cracks people try to hide. On screen, she wasn't playing an untouchable icon. She was playing someone viewers recognized in their own families, their own neighborhoods, sometimes even in themselves. That connection turned her into more than a celebrity. It turned her into a cultural reference point.
Walang himala!
So yung aming napanood na walang himala, take 1 yun, Tigay.
Take 1 po.
Wow.
Kasi hindi pwede mag-take 2.
Actors began shaping stories around her emotional range instead of spectacle. Casting shifted. Audiences started expecting vulnerability instead of glamour. And slowly, whether they admitted it or not, everyone else in her era was being judged against the standard she set. But what made her rise even more powerful was this. She wasn't rising alone. Because at the same time, another name was carving a completely different path to the top. And while one legacy was being built on raw emotion and quiet realism, another was taking shape in a completely different arena. Vilma Santos didn't just rise through the screen, she rose through the system itself. Where Nora became a mirror of everyday life, Vilma became a symbol of momentum, visibility, and reach. Her presence was polished, confident, and unmistakably dominant. She moved easily between box office hits and serious drama, proving that popularity and performance didn't have to cancel each other out. Audiences didn't just watch her. They followed her. Studios trusted her to carry projects. The media followed every move. And over time, her influence stretched far beyond film.
Alam niyo ho, salami kasi katabi namin dito yung malarayat.
This is where the rivalry narrative took on a life of its own. Fans didn't just compare roles. They compared what each woman represented. One stood for emotional closeness and personal struggle. The other stood for ambition, leadership, and public power. 2 careers, same generation, completely different definitions of success. And that contrast did something unexpected. It forced the industry to widen its idea of what greatness could look like. But while these 2 names dominated the spotlight, another figure was quietly ruling an entirely different kingdom, not through tears or prestige, but through laughter that reached every corner of everyday life. And while drama and prestige were shaping one side of the conversation, comedy was building an empire of its own. Dolphy didn't need film festivals or critical debates to prove his influence. His stage was the living room, the neighborhood, the kind of place where people gathered not to analyze a performance, but to feel lighter after a long day. His humor was grounded in ordinary life. The struggles of work, family, pride, and survival weren't dressed up. They were turned into something people could laugh at without losing themselves in it. That made him more than a comedian. It made him a constant presence in everyday culture. Someone whose voice and face felt as familiar as a relative who always showed up unannounced.
Hoy, ikaw tanda ah. Huwag kang tingin ng tingin sa baraha ko ah. Uukitin ko yung mata mo.
What made his legacy complicated was this. His reach was massive, but his recognition in serious artistic spaces often lagged behind. While dramatic performances were dissected and archived, comedy was treated as something fleeting, something meant to pass. Yet his characters stayed, his lines stayed, his influence stayed. And that raises a quiet question that still hangs over this generation. If laughter lasts just as long as tears, who really shapes memory? Because beyond the spotlight and the punchlines, another kind of presence was building its own authority. One that didn't demand attention, but earned it through silence. And after the laughter faded, a different kind of presence stepped in. Not loud, not commanding, just steady. Christopher de Leon built his reputation on the kind of performances that didn't chase attention, but held it. While others filled the screen with emotion or energy, he often did the opposite, pulling everything inward, letting silence do the work. His characters weren't larger than life. They were grounded, restrained, and often conflicted in ways that felt deeply human. That made him a natural fit for stories that needed credibility instead of spectacle. Across decades of changing trends, he remained relevant not by reinventing himself, but by refining a style that trusted the audience to lean in rather than be pulled forward. There's a certain authority in that kind of consistency. Directors relied on him to anchor scenes that could easily drift into exaggeration. Viewers trusted him to make even the smallest moments feel real. In an industry that often rewards reinvention and reinvention alone, his power came from reliability. And that reliability created a bridge between generations. He wasn't just a leading man of one era. He became a reference point for what grounded acting looked like as the industry evolved around him. But just as his influence stretched across time, another figure was stepping in to connect this generation to what came next, bringing the weight of legacy into a new kind of spotlight. And as one generation began to settle into legend, another kind of star was rising to carry its influence forward. Sharon Cuneta entered the scene at a moment when audiences were ready for something that felt both familiar and new. She didn't replace what came before her. She absorbed it, reshaped it, and carried it into a changing industry that was learning how to balance tradition with mass appeal. Her early image leaned heavily on youth and visibility, but what kept her in the conversation was her ability to move beyond that. Over time, her roles grew heavier, more emotionally layered, more willing to sit with conflict instead of smoothing it over. That shift made her a kind of translator between eras, someone who could speak the language of classic performance while navigating a more modern, media-driven spotlight.
We had so much fun in the interview, and if you play it again, in the interview and during the shoot.
Fame in her case became both an advantage and a burden. Every role arrived with expectations attached. Every performance compared not just to peers, but to a legacy that stretched backward. Yet that pressure also placed her in a rare position. She wasn't just part of the story of this generation. She became one of the ways audiences learned how to move on from it. And while she was helping carry that torch forward, another actor was doing the opposite, using film not as a bridge, but as a quiet form of resistance. And while some careers were built on carrying the past forward, others were shaped by pushing directly against the present. Bembol Rocco became closely tied to stories that didn't aim to comfort. They aimed to confront. His roles often lived in spaces marked by tension, uncertainty, and quiet defiance, turning the screen into a reflection of social pressure rather than escape from it. There was a rawness to his performances that felt deliberate. He didn't soften characters to make them easier to watch. He leaned into their flaws, their doubts, and their moments of moral hesitation. That approach made his presence feel risky, almost unstable in the best way. Like something unexpected could happen in any scene he stepped into. Directors used him as a kind of signal. When he appeared, audiences knew the story was about to move into heavier territory. Politics, class, power, and consequence weren't just background elements. They were woven into the way he carried himself on screen. What set him apart wasn't just intensity, it was purpose. His performances felt less like entertainment and more like participation in a larger conversation about what society was and what it was becoming. But not every powerful performance came from confrontation. Some came from complexity, the kind that lived inside the mind rather than out in the open, waiting to be noticed. And after the tension of confrontation, a different kind of intensity took over. One that didn't raise its voice, but sharpened its edges. Hilda Koronel became known for stepping into roles that lived in moral gray zones, where answers weren't handed to the audience and comfort was never guaranteed. Her presence signaled that a story was about to move into deeper, quieter territory. She thrived in films that leaned toward the experimental and the introspective. Instead of broad emotion, her performances focused on restraint, on the small shifts in expression that hinted at what a character wasn't saying. That subtlety made her a natural fit for directors who wanted their work to be felt rather than explained.
Okay, papaguin kong tanong. She thinks she's in love with you. Is that it, huh?
What made her legacy stand out was the kind of risks she took. These weren't roles designed for applause or easy admiration. They were often unsettling, sometimes deliberately distant, and always challenging. In an industry that rewarded familiarity, she chose unpredictability. That choice placed her in a unique space. She wasn't chasing mass appeal, but she wasn't hidden either. She became a marker for prestige, a name associated with films that asked more of their audience than simple attention. And as her characters explored complexity on screen, another performer was doing something just as demanding, turning the inner world of the mind into the main stage for every role. And as stories moved deeper into moral complexity, Laurice Galen took that journey inward. Her performances often felt less like portrayals and more like quiet studies of what people hide beneath their words. Where others used action or intensity to define a scene, she used stillness, letting the smallest shifts in expression carry the weight of an entire moment. She gravitated toward characters who lived in emotional gray areas, people shaped by doubt, conflict, and unspoken history. That made her work feel intimate, almost private, as if the audience were witnessing thoughts rather than actions. It wasn't always comfortable to watch, and that discomfort became part of her signature.
Hi. Yeah.
What set her apart was control. Every movement felt deliberate, every pause intentional. Directors trusted her to hold scenes together without raising the volume, to create tension without relying on confrontation. In a medium that often leans toward the dramatic, she proved that quiet could be just as commanding. Her influence extended beyond performance. She became part of a broader creative conversation about how stories could be told, how characters could be built from the inside out instead of from spectacle. And as her work explored the power of subtlety, another actor entered with the opposite energy, bringing fire, urgency, and a presence that could shift the atmosphere of a scene the moment he appeared. And just when restraint seemed to define the tone, Michael de Mesa arrived with a spark that refused to stay contained. His presence carried an edge, a sense that something volatile was always close to the surface. Even before a line was spoken, the energy in the scene changed, as if the story itself had to adjust around him. He often took on roles tied to authority, rebellion, or internal conflict, characters caught between control and collapse. That tension became his signature. Where others invited audiences to lean in, he pushed them back in their seats, demanding attention through sheer intensity.
So technically, you can say that I'm based here in America.
What made his performances compelling wasn't just volume or force, it was unpredictability. You never quite knew which version of the character would emerge in the next moment, the calm exterior or the sudden break beneath it. That uncertainty kept his roles alive, even in stories that might have otherwise felt familiar. Over time, that fire turned into a kind of shorthand. When he appeared, viewers expected friction, confrontation, and emotional stakes that felt immediate and real. He became a marker for scenes that mattered, moments where the story was about to test its own limits. But not every powerful presence relied on tension. Some built their legacy on something just as difficult to master, making people laugh without ever letting them forget the world they were living in. And after all that intensity, the mood shifted the moment Babalu appeared. Laughter wasn't just a reaction to his performances. It was almost a reflex. His comedy didn't wait for permission. It arrived through exaggerated movement, unexpected timing, and a physical presence that turned even ordinary moments into something memorable. What made him stand out wasn't just humor, but accessibility. His characters felt like they came from the same streets, the same routines, the same daily frustrations as the audience watching him. That connection gave his comedy weight beneath the silliness. People weren't just laughing at a joke. They were recognizing themselves in the situation behind it.
Paolo, sino yung kasama mo?
Ha? Mga tita ko.
Mga tita mo? Ang papangit!
While dramatic actors were often praised for depth and complexity, Babalu mastered something just as demanding, staying unforgettable in a few minutes of screen time. He became the kind of performer who could walk into a scene and quietly steal it, leaving behind a line, a gesture, or a reaction that viewers carried long after the story moved on. His legacy lives in repetition. Clips replayed, catchphrases remembered, moments shared across generations. Not because they were analyzed, but because they were felt. And as his humor reflected everyday life, another comedian built a different kind of connection. One rooted not in spectacle, but in familiarity so strong it felt like looking in a mirror. And where Babalu thrived on energy and exaggeration, Redford White built his presence on something quieter and just as powerful: recognition. His characters didn't feel like performers stepping into a role. They felt like people audiences already knew. The neighbor who complained too much, the coworker who always had a story, the relative who somehow ended up in the middle of every situation. That sense of familiarity became his signature. He wasn't playing a punchline. He was playing a type, a personality drawn straight from everyday life. The humor came not from spectacle, but from how closely his characters mirrored the routines and frustrations people lived through themselves.
Sino yan? Kilala mo yan?
Hindi ko kilala yan.
Sige na po, pumunta na kayo sa bahay namin.
Opo. May narinig kang po?
What made this approach so effective was its durability. Trends in comedy changed, formats shifted from film to television and back again, but his style stayed relevant because the source never did. Ordinary life remained ordinary, and that gave him an endless well of material to draw from. He became a kind of cultural shorthand. You didn't need to explain what kind of character he was playing. The moment he appeared, audiences understood the role, the tone, and the rhythm of the scene. And while his humor leaned on the familiar, another figure from this era built his legacy on something older and deeper. Traditions passed down, not just remembered, but inherited. And as the spotlight moved from the familiar to the foundational, Panchito represented something rare in this generation. A living link to an earlier chapter of Filipino entertainment. His career carried the rhythm and timing of classic comedy into a new era, bridging the gap between traditions formed on stage and the evolving language of film and television. He wasn't just performing jokes. He was preserving a style, the kind built on timing, partnership, and an unspoken understanding between performers that could turn a simple exchange into something memorable. Through his long-running collaborations, he helped define how comedic duos worked, how personalities bounced off each other, and how humor could be built as much on silence as on sound.
559. Ibig sabihin, kapanganak mo pa lamang nangungutang ka na ng monay.
What made his presence unique was its sense of continuity. In an industry that often celebrates what's new, he represented what endured. Audiences weren't just watching a performer. They were watching a tradition being carried forward in real time. That kind of influence doesn't always show up in awards or headlines. It shows up in the next generation of comedians who copy a gesture, a pause, a way of standing on screen without even realizing where it came from. And while his legacy was rooted in partnership and history, another performer from this era built his reputation on reinvention, moving between roles so completely that audiences were never quite sure which version they would see next. And as tradition gave way to transformation, Chiquito became the embodiment of unpredictability. Few performers in this generation moved as fluidly between roles as he did, shifting from imposing antagonist to playful comedian with a confidence that kept audiences guessing. The moment he appeared, there was always a sense that the story could turn in any direction. His early work often leaned into authority and intimidation, building a presence that felt heavy and commanding. But what made his career remarkable was his willingness to dismantle that image. He stepped into comedy not as a side project, but as a full reinvention, reshaping how people saw him and what he could do.
Hirap sa inyo. Bakit ininvest niyo ako ng mga mahihirap? Di paano ko ng altindore may pasol. Bakit kakanya kayong atlo?
That ability to pivot became his signature. Instead of being trapped by typecasting, he treated every role as an opportunity to rewrite expectations. Villainy gave way to humor. Seriousness gave way to absurdity. And in that contrast, he found a space that felt uniquely his own. Audiences didn't just watch him perform. They watched him transform. That sense of motion, of constant change, kept his career alive across shifting trends and tastes. But while Chiquito built his legacy on movement and surprise, another figure from this era built his on something just as powerful and far more enduring: authority earned through sheer longevity. And as unpredictability gave way to permanence, Eddie Garcia stood as something close to an institution. His presence didn't just fill a role, it carried history with it. By the time he stepped into a scene, he brought decades of performance behind him, and that weight alone was enough to shift the balance of any story. He moved effortlessly between archetypes. One moment, a feared antagonist. The next, a weary mentor, a sharp-tongued authority figure, or even a source of unexpected humor. What tied all those roles together wasn't style, but credibility. Audiences believed him, no matter which side of the moral line he stood on.
Yung kung anong nagawa niya sa industriya ng Pilipinas, ng film.
Longevity became his quiet signature. While trends rose and fell, he remained, adapting without losing his core. Younger actors measured themselves against his discipline. Directors relied on him to anchor scenes that needed gravity without exaggeration. He became a kind of reference point for what professionalism in performance looked like. There's a certain power in being everywhere, across generations, across genres, across decades. His legacy wasn't built on a single defining role, but on a body of work so wide it became part of the industry's foundation itself. And yet, even with all that visibility, some of the most essential work of this era happened in the background, carried by performers who didn't command the spotlight, but quietly held entire stories together. And after the weight of authority, the focus shifts to something almost invisible. Johnny Delgado built his reputation not by standing at the center of the frame, but by making sure everything around him felt real. His performances rarely asked for attention, yet they shaped the emotional ground on which entire scenes were built. He became a familiar face in stories that aimed for honesty over spectacle. Whether in independent films or more mainstream projects, his presence carried a kind of groundedness that made situations feel lived in rather than performed. You believed the world on screen because he seemed to belong to it. What made his work stand out was how easily he disappeared into his roles. There was no sense of a persona following him from film to film. Each character felt like a separate life, briefly intersecting with the audience before moving on. That ability to vanish is often overlooked, but it's one of the hardest skills to master. Directors valued him as a stabilizing force. Actors leaned on him as a scene partner who could elevate a moment without overpowering it. And as his quiet realism shaped the emotional texture of many stories, another performer brought a different kind of grounding. One built not on subtlety, but on a raw, unfiltered sense of grit that refused to soften its edges. And where subtlety held the line, Pen Medina pushed straight through it. His performances carried a roughness that felt deliberate, almost confrontational. He often stepped into roles tied to power, conflict, and social tension, bringing a presence that made scenes feel heavier the moment he arrived. There was nothing polished about the way he approached his characters. He leaned into their sharp edges, their impatience, their authority, and sometimes their cruelty. That refusal to soften made his work feel uncomfortably real, as if the audience weren't watching a story unfold, but witnessing a situation they couldn't easily step away from.
May nakakita ba sa'yo nung mapulot mo to?
Wala po.
Ano bang balak mong gawin sa pera?
Di ko po alam.
He became a natural fit for films that explored hierarchy, control, and resistance. When he appeared, the stakes seemed to rise, not because of what the script said, but because of what his presence implied. Power struggles felt personal. Confrontations felt inevitable. What made his legacy distinctive was consistency. Across different projects and eras, he maintained that grounded intensity, becoming a kind of shorthand for realism with teeth. And while his roles often lived in the world of authority and force, another performer from this generation chose a different kind of risk, stepping into characters so bold and emotionally exposed that even the industry hesitated before following her lead.
Napakalakas, napakagandang pelikula ang ginawa ni Ronnie Lazaro. Maraming eksena ang nakakagulat, hindi mo makakasahan.
And after the weight of power and confrontation, the story turns to a different kind of bravery. Dexter Doria built her reputation on stepping into roles that didn't offer safety or easy admiration. Her characters often lived at the edges of comfort, forcing audiences to sit with emotions and situations they might have preferred to look away from. She didn't chase likability. She chased truth, even when that truth was messy, unsettling, or difficult to watch. That willingness to be vulnerable on screen gave her performances a rawness that felt almost too real at times, blurring the line between acting and exposure.
Wala pa, hindi pa nila pinapadala. Virtual yung show eh.
Oo.
At fish, ano siya?
Mozzarella?
Hindi, fish.
Ah, fish. Okay.
Kakaiba.
Directors trusted her with material others might have declined. Scenes that required emotional risk, moral ambiguity, or personal collapse often found their way to her. And instead of softening those moments, she leaned into them, making them impossible to ignore. Her legacy isn't built on a long list of leading roles. It's built on impact, on the way a single scene could stay with viewers long after the rest of the story faded. And as her work challenged audiences to confront discomfort, another performer from this era offered something just as powerful in a different way. Familiarity that felt like coming home. A presence that anchored stories in a sense of continuity and emotional stability.
Foreigner siya. Naniligawan ako ng niligawan. As in, mas bata siya sa akin ha. 45 ako, 30 lang siya. Pero,
wow!
And after the intensity of confrontation and emotional risk, the tone settles into something steadier, almost reassuring. Mona Lisa became a presence that audiences could rely on. A familiar face that brought a sense of balance to stories often filled with conflict and uncertainty. When she appeared, the emotional temperature of a scene changed, not by rising, but by finding its center. Her roles often leaned into family, memory, and continuity. She played characters who carried history with them, figures who seemed to understand what came before and what might come after. That made her more than a supporting presence. She became a kind of emotional reference point, someone the audience could hold on to as the story moved through turmoil. What made her influence lasting was consistency. Across decades, she remained recognizable not just in appearance, but in tone. There was a quiet strength in the way she delivered lines, a sense that her characters had already lived full lives beyond the edges of the screen. That depth gave weight to even the smallest moments. A glance, a pause, a simple exchange could feel like it carried years of unspoken history. And as her work grounded stories in familiarity and memory, another performer from this generation carved a different path. One driven by conflict, urgency, and roles that seemed to burn bright and fast rather than settle into comfort. And as comfort gives way to friction, Rez Cortez steps into the frame with a presence that feels charged from the first moment. His performances often carried a sense of urgency, as if the character were always on the edge of a decision that could tip everything in a new direction. There was little room for neutrality in the roles he chose. He became closely associated with stories shaped by political tension, moral conflict, and social pressure. When he appeared, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations felt sharper. Confrontations felt closer. Even quiet moments carried an undercurrent of something unresolved.
Yung old school type of treatment ng mga kontrabida ay gagawin dito, but in digital form.
What defined his work was focus. He didn't scatter his energy across a scene. He directed it, narrowing in on the emotional core of a moment and holding it there until the audience couldn't look away. That made his performances feel concentrated, almost distilled, like a single emotion pushed to its limit. His career didn't chase broad visibility. Instead, it carved out a specific space, one where intensity itself became the signature, For viewers who recognized it, his name became a marker for stories that didn't shy away from discomfort or complexity. And as his roles burned with immediacy, another figure from this era approached performance from the opposite direction, bringing discipline, restraint, and a sense of craft shaped long before the camera ever started rolling.
Sa pag-artista, malaking naitulong niya kasi director din si FPJ. At kung hindi niyo alam, pag nagdi-direct siya, ang pangalan niya sa...
And after all that urgency and emotional heat, the rhythm slows into something more deliberate. Dante Rivero carried the discipline of the stage into every frame he entered. His performances felt measured, controlled, and carefully shaped, as if each word and movement had already been tested long before it reached the camera. Where others relied on spontaneity or intensity, he relied on structure. There was a sense of craft behind everything he did, a feeling that the character had been built from the inside out rather than assembled in the moment. That approach gave his roles a quiet authority, one that didn't demand attention but steadily earned it.
Alam ko, marami na akong pagkukulang sa iyo. And if I can...
He often gravitated toward characters defined by restraint, figures who held back more than they revealed. That made his emotional moments stand out even more. When something finally broke through the surface, it felt earned, not performed. In a generation known for both spectacle and confrontation, he represented a different tradition, one rooted in patience, training, and respect for the mechanics of storytelling itself. His work served as a reminder that acting isn't only about feeling. It's also about control, timing, and knowing exactly when to let emotions speak. And with that final portrait of this generation in place, all these paths, fame, subtlety, laughter, intensity, and craft, circle back to the same question that refuses to fade.
Patawarin mo ko, anak.
And after moving through every path this generation carved, fame and subtlety, laughter and confrontation, tradition and reinvention, it all leads back to one unresolved idea. What actually defines a legacy? Is it the face everyone recognizes the moment it appears on screen? The performer who quietly holds a scene together without ever being named the star? Or the comedian whose lines live on in everyday conversation long after the movie ends?
May nakakita ba sa'yo nung mapulot mo to?
Wala po.
Ano ba ang balak mong gawin sa pera?
Di ko po alam.
This era didn't give the country one answer. It gave it a spectrum. Each of these actors shaped memory in a different way. And which one feels most important often says as much about the viewer as it does about the performer. Some people look for emotional truth. Others look for cultural impact. Others just look for the person who made them feel something when they needed it most. So now I want to hear from you. Who is your favorite from this generation and why? Drop their name in the comments and tell us what moment or role made them unforgettable for you. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it, share your thoughts below, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming uploads.